Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're going to be talking a lot about energy storage and how it plays in the evolving electricity grid. We got a great panel, and we're looking forward to an active Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to participate with the Q&A tab that you see on your screen. I am Ron DeFelice. I am actually in Chapel Hill. I have a consulting firm called Energy Intelligence Partners, where we advise and consult on all things energy storage. And we also have an energy storage project development arm, where we are actively developing utility scale energy storage projects across the US. And the scale of those projects is, if you're familiar with megawatts, 2 to 80 megawatts in size, typically on a solar equivalent side. So what we're going to do, the format today is going to be each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to introduce themselves and walk through a couple of slides to give you some perspective on how they see the energy storage markets and how they participate in it through their day jobs. And then once each of the panelists has given their overview, we will have a panel discussion, and I'm going to moderate the discussion and ask questions to the panelists, and hopefully we'll get some questions from you all and have time to answer those as well. And so we've got a nice allotment of time here, about 50 minutes, 55 minutes. And so look forward to this discussion. I'm going to introduce Brian Bartholomew, who's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He's currently the U.S. power analyst for Bloomberg and a UNC grad. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Great. Thanks, Ron. So excited to be here. I guess in the pandemic, this is as close as I can get to Chapel Hill. So I'm an analyst with Bloomberg NEF. We're the primary research arm of Bloomberg. So publishing reports, models, data sets on wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, hydrogen commodities, kind of all the different angles of the energy transition. And what I'm going to share today is just a few snapshots of why we're just generally excited about energy storage, why we're talking about it. Later on, we'll delve into more the nuance of business models, barriers to development, but this is just a high-level view of why it's exciting right now. We can jump into the next one. And part of the reason is this Moore's Law-esque phenomenon for renewables. And it's called an experience curve. And what this experience curve principle states is that for every increase, or for every doubling of the amount of total solar panels on the left, or wind turbines, or battery packs you produce, the cost of producing that thing actually falls by a fixed amount. So that's what these blue highlighted numbers are here. For every doubling of global installed solar capacity, we've actually seen prices fall by the fixed rate of around 29%. It's around 8% for wind turbines, 18% for batteries. The reason this is so cool, right, is because there's no one fundamental reason this should be happening. It's just a function of all these accrued, incremental manufacturing improvements and economies of scale. So if we can jump to the next slide. And this is kind of a look at what that's actually meant in terms of cost declines. So this is showing batteries right now. But for solar, we've seen the cost of a solar panel fall by more than 80% over the past decade. We've seen the cost of a wind turbine plummet by more than half. We've seen the cost of batteries fall by nearly 90% since 2010, right? So all these applications like electric vehicles, batteries for good storage that might seem kind of absurd at $1,000 per kilowatt hour battery pack prices are now coming into the money. So that's kind of why the cost side is very exciting. And I want to share a brief kind of California case study of why it's batteries time in terms of value on the grid as well. So we can jump to the next one. Oh, sorry, one more on costs, and then we can talk about this later, but just looking ahead at how many electric vehicles, good scale batteries are going to be built, pairing this up with experience curves, we still think there's a lot of room for battery costs to fall going out into the future. So jumping into the next one. Cool. All right. Guys, I'm throwing you into the deep end. So if you can hang with me through this, you get to be an honorary power analyst. So what we're looking at here is the average daily generation and price profile in California over the last decade. So if you look at these little windows, each one of these is the average day in a year. So we've got our radioactive green nuclear generation, gray gas, gray imports, dark blue hydro, and a little bit of wind and solar. And we're going to look at how renewables reshape power prices. So if we look back to 2011, it's a fairly simple world. You're going to notice that red power price line follows the overall shape of generation. This makes sense, right? The more power supply you need, the more plants you're going to have to turn on, the more expensive that kind of final price setting unit's going to be. Fast forward to 2015, you've got this sunny side up egg of solar popping up in the middle of the day. You'll actually notice that that red price line dips right when solar's online. Why is this happening? Think about solar, right? It doesn't cost anything to generate. You're not buying coal, you're not buying gas to generate power. So it actually means you need less of power supply that actually costs something to generate. So that's why prices dip when solar comes online. And we can jump to the next one. And so if you ever hear the duck curve phenomenon, that kind of shape is where that name comes from. You fast forward into 2018, 2019, 2020, even more solar coming online, prices getting absolutely crushed in the middle of the day, right? And then rebounding in the evening. So all those gas plants have to rapidly ramp up to try to keep up with the solar falling offline to keep the lights on. Next one. And so we're testing out a new level of duck curve phenomenon. So next one and last. So I want you to think about what these price signals are telling us, right? If you look at that red power price line in 2020, it's extremely low in the middle of the day, saying if you want to buy power here, it can be very cheap. The market doesn't need any more power here. Look at how it spikes up in the evening, right? That's saying you get a great reward if you can deliver energy in that window, right? Chance to buy low, sell high. Does anybody hear that? Yes, that's batteries walk-on music. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Next up, we have James Robinson, who's an energy storage project development manager from Strata Solar, which is a Chapel Hill company, but I think they've since moved to Durham and have operations nationwide. Brian. Oh, I'm sorry, James. Thanks, Brian.
No problem. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, so I'm James Robinson. I work for Strata Solar. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Strata to get going. So we are developers, operators, EPCs, and owners of solar and increasingly storage. On the solar side, we have over 2 gigawatts of installed capacity and over 250 projects developed and constructed. So that makes us one of the largest developers in the country. We have 400 full-time staff. Most of them are based in Durham, North Carolina. I myself, I'm based in New York City, and our development team tends to be spread out across the country. On the storage side, we have over 400 megawatt hours of contracted storage and 3 gigawatt hours of storage in the pipeline. Next slide, please. So when we talk about energy storage, there's actually a lot of different things that the energy storage can actually be doing. This diagram on the left is from Rocky Mountain Institute from a paper called The Economics of Battery Energy Storage. A few years old now, but really interesting reading if you want to look it up online. And it lays out 13 different services that energy storage can provide to 3 different stakeholders. So the customers, so that's like the end users, the utilities, and to the grid operators. So when we as project developers are trying to build a storage project, we're trying to figure out which of these services can we provide with this particular project, and how do we get enough of them added together to make the economics work out and be able to build the project. These services can kind of be grouped into 2 main categories. The first is storage can offload peak capacity. So what that means is that the power system historically has really been built from the power plant all the way through the transmission, the distribution system, and all the substations in between to support the peak demand. So in North Carolina, you have maybe the hottest day of the summer. That's when the electricity demand is the highest. And so everything in that chain has to be sized up to be able to support that one day or even that 1 hour. That's not the most cost-effective way to build things out, but it's been the only way that there is because there hasn't been, we haven't had the ability to store electricity on a large scale. As battery storage, the costs come down, that's changing. And so there's this opportunity that we now have to not have to size everything in the system to that peak hour of that peak day. The second big thing, a big category, it can change input and output very quickly at the second level. So typically the generators have had to adjust their output in order to match the demand, because the demand is made up of a bunch of residences and a bunch of businesses, and they're all doing different things, and there's not really a good way to control the demand. And so the supply, the generators have had to match with, have had to ramp up and down. But as you get more and more renewables on the grid, that becomes problematic because solar and wind are intermittent. They don't necessarily have the ability, or they don't have the ability when not paired with storage, to be able to ramp up and down. So as we get these renewables on the grid, we're going to have to increasingly rely on storage to have the supply side ramp up and down on a second by second level in order to match the demand. Next slide, please. So this is one of our projects, our biggest storage project to date. It's called Ventura Energy Storage, and I included it here just so you can kind of see what this actually looks like on the ground. This is a 100 megawatt, 400 megawatt hour project, and it's going to be commissioned in Q1 of 2021. It will be one of the largest in the country when it's commissioned. It will be using the Tesla Megapacks, and you can see just kind of the size of this installation, and that all of those Megapacks lined up in where that arrow is that's what makes up that 100 megawatt, 400 megawatt hour project. Next slide, please. So when you keep thinking about that number, 100 megawatts, WoodMac is projecting that energy storage installations globally will be hitting 15 gigawatts by 2024. So that's 15,000 megawatts. So that's like 150 of those Ventura projects just by 2024. So that, when you think of the size of that one project and you're gonna, the projections for how much storage there will be, there's really just a lot of really big projects that need to get built. And because energy storage project development, it's a very long process. So these projects have to be developed one at a time, and the interconnection processes, the permitting processes can take many years to get through. So what that means is that in order to hit these projections, the project development for all of these projects really has to be starting now, and in the next year, moving forward as the storage grows, the development activities will have to grow also. So that's what Strata is doing along with our colleagues in the project development industry, and it's really interesting place to be, and we look forward to helping to hit these targets that WoodMac and others are putting out. And that's all from me. So I'll turn it back over to Ron.
Thank you, James. Very good. And our last panelist is David Nenon. He's a senior global supply manager for a company you may have heard of called Tesla. Over to you, David.
Hey, thanks, Ron. Hey, everyone. It's great. Always a great day to be chatting with Tar Heels. I'm a UNC class of 2014. Looking forward to chatting with you all today. And thanks to Brian and James for really setting the stage here. So hopefully you're getting the idea that batteries are kind of the jelly to, the renewables peanut butter. It's a really beautiful combination that we have here. And there's a lot of exciting stuff that can happen on our grid. And from a Tesla perspective, we're also pretty focused on the vehicles right now, although we're far from a car company. We are a sustainability company at the end of the day. And the question that I like to ask myself is just how many of these batteries do we actually need to live sustainably, and then how do we get there? So this answer is deeply rooted in the battery supply chain, which is my team's focus. Because at the end of the day, you can only build as many batteries as you actually have material supply for and manufacturing capability for. So let's dive in and just take a brief look at the battery supply chain. It's sort of a behind the scenes thing that I would say isn't as well known in batteries. So next slide, please, Ron. So this is using an example, not of Tesla, but of CATL. They are the world's second largest battery manufacturer. They were the first largest for a while before being dethroned by their rival LG Chem. And ultimately, at a high level, the battery supply chain is really complex. It stretches all the way from a mine to the final storage system, be it on the grid or be it underneath your electric vehicle or in your garage as a backup power supply. And there are tons of different stakeholders in between. And as James mentioned, these project developments are many-year projects. And the battery supply chain is the same sort of challenge. You can't build a new lithium mine overnight or a new nickel mine overnight. These are 5 to 7 year projects. And so we have a lot of exciting things in the pipeline, a lot of projected demand. But at the end of the day, the supply chain has to be able to keep up. So after we've mined different metals from the ground, there's a series of different components in the battery, and the 4 key ones are shown here. We have a cathode, we have an anode, we have a separator that lets the cathode and anode not touch each other, and then everything is filled together with an electrolyte that allows the lithium ions to move back and forth. And the key takeaway here is that these are all very energy intensive, honestly not terribly sustainable processes. We really need to continue to innovate in the supply chain to reduce the amount of wastewater that's used, to reduce the amount of energy that's used, and ideally be sourcing from renewable sources rather than a coal plant or an oil plant of things of that nature. So once these components are all finished, they come from all over the world. They are transported all over the world, which is also a challenge for sustainability. And then you actually get into building the battery itself. The cell is sort of like a little AA or AAA sort of factor, and then those are built into modules and then into packs. And then something that is of important interest is going to be the recycling at the end of the day. But ultimately, this is sort of an overview of the battery supply chain, starting from the mine and ending with a vehicle or a finished battery pack or something like that. Next slide, please, Ron. And what I want to focus on, one more back. Yeah, so what I want to focus on here and point out is that if we're going to achieve this huge growth in batteries, the supply chain needs to grow with us. And the most difficult area of that is going to be the mining and refining, and then also processing these metals into the cathode. These, again, are very long lead time projects, 5 to 7 years to build a new mine. And miners don't want to invest until they receive that price signal from the market that the metals prices will be going up. There's excitement for batteries. And so ultimately, it's going to take a concerted effort here. And so these are, for the supply chain, these are areas of intense focus to really try to expand. How can we better mine lithium? Can we recycle it? Can we develop a new green process for making a cathode and things of that nature? So next slide, please. And this is really the challenge to me laid out. We've thrown out a lot of different metric prefixes here, mega, giga, and if you watch Tesla Battery Day, Elon has declared that Tera is the new giga. We're going up, and away. And to put this in perspective, these are on here on the left, these are the world's largest lithium-ion battery manufacturers. And it's no small feat to manufacture 50 gigawatt hours a year of capacity if you're LG Chem, for example. That translates out to billions and billions of battery cells pouring out of their factory every year. And we're still many orders of magnitude short of where we need to be. We have to get to terawatt hour storage. So our supply chain really needs to scale with us, as well as our battery manufacturing. But it's always worth keeping the opportunities in mind along with the challenges, because when we get to the day when an electric vehicle has the same sticker price as a Honda Accord, or a utility can buy energy more cost effectively from a solar plus storage project than from a coal plant, then everyone wins. So next slide, please, Ron. And I just wanted to point out one, this is sort of a new hot off the presses from last week, a game changer opening up from FERC, who controls or helps control the grid. And what this now means is that distributed energy resources, or DERs, solar assets, battery assets, can now effectively function as tiny power plants. So imagine your car is sitting in your garage, and at night, as Brian pointed us, when the electricity prices are spiking again, imagine that your car has charged itself up during the day, and then it sells that electricity back to the grid at night. So your car is just sitting in your garage making money for you. So these are some of the things that we're really excited about with Tesla, but with the clean tech field as a whole. So looking forward to jumping more into the questions with you all now.
Great.
Back to you, Rob.
Thank you, David. I'm going to come out of sharing my slides. And if you guys can turn on your videos and unmute yourselves, that'd be great. We can start our discussion. And for the audience, please do feel free to send in your questions. We've got, there's a chat and there's a Q&A. We prefer you send in questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, but also feel free, if you want to use the chat, go for it. And I'm going to start my video back up. Okay, so I'm going to throw out the first question as we wait for questions to come in from the audience. Just kind of broadly, I wanted to get each of the panelists' perspectives on the greatest opportunities that they see in terms of value proposition for grid scale energy storage to reduce CO2 emissions. So climate change is kind of top of mind for a lot of the audience. And so if you just comment on how energy storage plays into that and where you think the greatest opportunity is. And why don't we start with you, James?
Yeah, sure. So I think when we're talking about climate change and CO2 emissions in particular, I think it's really all about renewable integration with storage. Right now, the United States uses maybe 12% of the electricity generated is from intermittent renewables, so wind and solar, and that number has to go up, and it has to go up a lot. Ideally to close to 100%. And as that happens, the problem of not being able to dispatch those assets is going to just become increasingly difficult to manage. And so storage is the best way that we have right now to be able to scale up solar and wind to the extent it needs to be scaled up and still be able to match supply and demand and keep the lights on at all times.
Great, thank you. And Brian, why don't you take a shot and then I'll go to David.
Sure, and I'm sorry I can't get my camera working. I'm bummed. I haven't put on a real shirt. I was excited to do it. But yeah, I think as we kind of talked about, it's a really exciting time now, just because storage has been kind of playing more on the edge of grid services, doing a lot of really fast balancing, but now the cost has come down enough that it's really getting into that energy arbitrage role that we always imagine it doing. I would say, I guess in most markets now, right, storage is responding to prices, right? What it functionally does is integrating renewables, but really its incentives are set by prices. So if we want to maximize, how much emissions are being reduced, it's always helpful to have, like maybe carbon intensity reflected in those signals that the battery is actually responding to.
Great. And David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would double down on accelerating the transition to renewables. Every new technology is going to follow kind of an S-curve sort of thing. And we're just now getting into the point where we're really starting to hit this uptick. And I think James provided a great explanation of just how battery storage can help to smooth the intermittency problem. It doesn't completely solve for the problem, and that's definitely going to be a challenge ahead. But it really dramatically increases the utility of something like solar or wind. And I think there's an exciting thing ahead where, lithium ion batteries are just one flavor of energy storage. We've seen that solar, wind, hydro, everything brings something different to the table. And I think similarly, we're going to see that many different flavors of storage as they come online, each suited to different sorts of applications and geographies and paired with different sorts of power generation types. But I think it's really going to help us get far above 12%, as James mentioned, in a faster period of time than maybe anyone would have expected 5 or 10 years ago.
Great. And we've got some questions coming in. And so I think we'll turn to those. I want to, be responsive to what the audience wants to hear. So I think the first one's good. A topic I wanted to hit anyway was just kind of career path for each of the panelists. How did you all get into the jobs that you're in now? We have a graduating senior looking for opportunities and just wants to know about the best way to get started. So how about you, Brian? You go first.
Yeah, sure. And I think I have a feeling I might be the most roundabout route to the energy transition here. So at UNC, I always thought I was going to be doing economic stuff in China. So after graduating, ended up at the Natural Resources Defense Council over there. I ran into visa trouble before it was cool. And so basically I had to find something new. And at the time we had this BNF subscription, and it just, ticked a lot of boxes. I loved that it was much more kind of positive sum than kind of the international relations space or great ties to business. And yeah, I mean, just wanted to learn more about it. So made the transition to BNF. And I guess maybe one like high level takeaway from, I guess, just my particular case is that if you can bring the right analytical skill sets, if you're excited about it, there's definitely room for working in the energy transition, even if you don't have the kind of awesome engineering or dedicated environmental background that a lot of folks do.
And I'm going to ask every panelist this. Was it a cold call, like a application you submitted, or did you know someone there before you started?
So I did know someone there, so I had a general flavor for what the job entailed. But yeah, it definitely helped to have somebody give me an idea of what the interview process would look like. And obviously, especially right now, definitely don't get discouraged. I think I applied to maybe 20 or 30 jobs at that time, and only a few came through. So
very good. And David, how about you next?
Yeah, no problem. So I graduated from UNC in 2014. I studied chemistry and environmental science. Greg Ganji was a great help. He might remember that I probably wanted to change my major about 5 times because I just didn't know what the best fit for clean tech was. So if you're feeling similarly, don't worry. That's just par for the course. It really is a joy of getting to work in such an interdisciplinary field. I mean, if you just look at our little panel today and then extend that out to the whole clean tech world, everyone has come from a different path, a different major, a different career, and it makes it a lot of fun. But how did I actually get here? So after UNC, I moved out to California for graduate school. I wasn't quite ready to not be a student yet. So I tacked on a few more years to do a PhD in chemistry. Clean tech focus, but really just continued to feel the draw of wanting to be out in the market. I think next gen solutions are extremely important, but for me personally, I wanted to be working on products that were going out into the market today. And so I connected with a friend. I did have a friend who worked at Tesla. We were in the Clean Energy Club together at Berkeley, which was a fantastic networking opportunity, just getting to meet all of these interesting people from all sorts of different walks of life. And did an internship actually between my second to last year and final year of my PhD. So tested it out for about 4 months, really enjoyed it. And that's definitely a great way to get your foot in the door if you can. So I think being able to get myself an internship via knowing someone with the company, and then really the best possible resume you can have with a company is your body of work at that company. So it makes it easier to come back with a job offer.
Great, making it sound easy.
It's not easy.
James, how did you get to Strata?
Yeah, so I actually graduated with a degree in chemical and environmental engineering, so more on the technical side. And my first job out of college was actually down in the Triangle area of North Carolina. I was working for the EPA living in Chapel Hill, and really kind of on the environmental sciences type route. But I decided to kind of pivot out of that into a bit of a more project management and commercial role. So I worked for actually in the wastewater treatment industry for 2 or 3 years for a Chapel Hill-based company called NTX Technologies, which some of you may have heard of. And then ended up going up to New York City. I got a master's degree from Columbia in sustainability management. And my internship at that job was with a company called GI Energy. And that's what really led me into the project development space. GI Energy develops projects on a distributed generation scale, so smaller than what Strata's doing. So kind of a winding road. I think similarly to David, maybe like, and actually Brian also, like not really, I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do within the industry, especially when I was in school, but kind of learned what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing through my first couple of jobs out of school, and kind of honed things from there. I think, yeah, I'd reiterate that the renewable energy industry, it really is a very interdisciplinary space. And so I think one piece of advice that I would give is that try to figure out a piece of it that you really like and that you really want to kind of hone your skills in, whether that's the finance side or the engineering side, the regulatory side, because there's a lot of different avenues into the field. So kind of understand the overall space, that's really important, but then also try to figure out which piece of it draws you and that you'd want to be focusing on.
That's great. Thank you all for that. I'm going to go back to the Q&A, and we'll go to David for the Tesla question. So when we talk about vehicle to grid, grid to vehicle, the idea is basically, you know, you're going to use this battery pack that's under the hood that could be as big as 100 kilowatt hours to give back to the grid, to sell energy back to the grid when it's needed, to provide ancillary services, things like that. And then you're going to charge your car battery optimally when there's not a lot of demand and energy's cheap. And so there's this give and take that's envisioned. And to my knowledge, only the Nissan Leaf right now has the ability to do a vehicle to grid charging. So I didn't catch a Q&A yesterday for Battery Day. I did see the presentation, but we got a question that Elon said that they're not going to do V2G on Tesla vehicles. So what's your take? Is which is true? Is it happening for Teslas or is it not? And then what do you think of the prospects, David?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was, you know, it caught me a little bit by surprise, Elon's comment. It's like, that's why I put my final slide in there. I think it's a really exciting opportunity. But what I learned yesterday is actually that the first Teslas were able to do vehicle to grid, but no one used them. They worked really hard to create, you know, the bi-directional power flow and charging and all of the software to be able to use your car as a resource, your vehicle as a resource. So I think maybe it was a timing issue. I think maybe it was just, you know, it was the Tesla Roadster. It was just too early. People just weren't quite thinking about these things as a potential asset for the grid. So I do think that there's an opportunity as Tesla continues to grow their utility side. They have a software called Auto Bidder, which allows automatically your car or other energy asset to service the grid, interact with the grid. And I think maybe that'll be sort of the magic secret, is you need almost an Apple level of integration, just a beautiful little ecosystem, all of your products talking to each other, to where it's completely mindless for you. You should just be able to set it up and never worry about you know, what your car is doing overnight. But I think it's an exciting area, and I think that it will be interesting to see. But I think it's seemed to be an issue on the consumer side, actually. Rather, the technological feasibility is there. It is something that Tesla has engineered and put out there before. So maybe it just needs a second chance with the consumers and the customers.
Very good. Thank you for that. And I'm going to go jump around a little bit. I'm going to pass on the nuclear power question since we're an energy storage panel and don't want to get sidetracked here. Question for Strata. Can you talk about longer duration energy storage, longer than 4 hours? Are you all looking at that? And what technologies might they be if you are?
Yeah, so I think, so longer duration storage can mean a lot of different things. And I guess the question asked longer than, I think, what did it say, 4 hours?
Yeah, 4 hours.
Yeah, so that's could mean anything from like 5 or 6 hours up to seasonal storage, so months. And I think that the answer is that Strata, as project developers, like it's our job to keep an eye on all the different technologies that are available in the market, and also to understand where the potential sources of revenue for projects are. So when it comes to long duration storage, I think that both sides of that are a little bit, I guess, underdeveloped so far. There's not a ton of revenue drivers for longer duration storage, especially when you get beyond, say, 6 hours. For example, seasonal storage, there's really no revenue drivers at all right now. And on the technology side, lithium ion is so dominant and has such an advantage in that it just has a much larger installed base, so the price is so much lower that it really makes it tough for the other technologies to compete right now. So I'd say that in the short term, we're not developing longer duration storage projects, but it's definitely something that we're looking at and keeping an eye on. And as the markets and technologies mature, we'll probably enter that space as well.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to weigh in? Just let me know. Otherwise, I'll move on to another question. And so that question is about ancillary services. A good question for batteries and energy storage in general. So ancillary services are these services that all utilities have to provide to keep the lights on, that add into the cost of what we pay for power, but you know, they're not the energy per se. And so, you know, every time we turn a light on or off, the load on the grid goes up or down. And so there are things that are on standby or running that are compensated for changes in frequency so that we don't fry our equipment, for example. That's one example of ancillary services. And so the question is, what are the challenges in getting these valued for energy storage? And she just wanted us to talk more about battery services in general and how they are valued by RTOs and utilities. So I will go to Brian first. Are you guys tracking, you know, how storage is playing in the different ISOs and RTO markets in terms of ancillary services?
Yeah, and I think to even kind of frame this question a bit, you know, using that chart that James brought up earlier of all the different services that storage can provide, thinking about like active markets, right? Thinking about what they can do. There are like hourly energy markets, right? Where like hourly prices are set, hourly like dispatch instructions. There are 5-minute markets that get even more granular. And then some specific flavors of ancillary services that that you were just talking about, where you've actually got to respond, you know, on a like within seconds, you know, charge, discharge, up, down. I think ancillary services, I mean, if we think about what these are, essentially like balancing demand across different timescales, right? For ancillary services, it's going to be seconds. For kind of the 5-minute market, it's going to be minutes. For like the hourly stuff, it's going to be longer timescales. Batteries are best at that kind of second to second balancing, right? Nothing else on the grid is as flexible as them. And I mean, I think that's where we saw the first wave of grid scale batteries deployed, right, in PJM, so the kind of mid-Atlantic region. I think, yeah, these are kind of the most profitable first mover opportunities for batteries. But kind of the way we're looking at it is that, right, you can make a ton of money doing this as a battery, but if you look at kind of the overall market size, right, there's a ton of energy that needs to be balanced in kind of that, you know, hour to hour, day to day world. And that second to second world, there's not actually a ton of balancing that needs to be done. So even though this is the kind of first and most lucrative foothold for, you know, batteries to get into the market, we think that, you know, that revenue stream is going to drop pretty quickly as more batteries come in and fill that role. And they're going to have to start looking more towards that kind of energy arbitrage, roll over like longer durations, longer time horizons.
Great. And I will say, you know, for most of these markets, they do have value streams where if you can provide a service you can get registered and you can start making money for providing that service. The problem with energy storage is it can do so many things, and it can do multiple things at once. So people are trying to figure out the rules for including energy storage in each of these markets. And so that's really the bottleneck right now for storage being widely used for all kinds of things across the country. The rules have not caught up with the technology yet. And so it's going to take a couple of years for that to be flushed out before we kind of have true visibility into what energy storage can earn when you look at that wheel of potential applications that was shown earlier. So and a couple more Tesla questions. I think in general, though, I'd like to ask about the lithium-ion battery supply chain. We'll start with David. That's his area of expertise, but just how do you think about sustainability when we know that there's a lot of things being done in the supply chain right now that are not sustainable? I know yesterday that was talked a lot about at Battery Day, but you know, how do you answer that question with, okay, the batteries are doing a lot of good on the grid as we transition to more renewables, but at the same time, they're not really being produced sustainably?
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely a major trade-off that the field is facing right now. So as I mentioned, you know, the elephant in the room is that batteries are made from critical metals, nickel, cobalt, iron, being some of the keys. And that's a mining operation at the end of the day. And when you think about sustainability, you don't really think about a giant open-faced mine. And so there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there. In the long term, battery recycling, I think, is something incredibly important. And it's a really exciting direction. How do you disassemble a car, get your lithium, your nickel, and your cobalt back out, and make a cheaper battery the second time around? So that's sort of the long-term direction that I think everyone is trying to move towards. And you do yourself a favor there as well, because these metals are currently subject to market forces. They're out of people's control. But if you own the recycling process, you then own your supply chain. You own your metals prices. And it's a processing cost that's in your control rather than a market force that's outside of your control. But we're really trying to take a critical look at Tesla, and I think it's something we were really proud to share yesterday, and we hope it will be an example for the rest of the supply chain, is essentially taking our supply chain and making it our own. We use a lot of these metals that are mined and used for other applications as well. So for example, cobalt and nickel will be converted to a sulfate, a nickel sulfate or a cobalt sulfate. But you don't actually have to do that. We've unveiled a new technology that you can use nickel metal or cobalt metal directly, very, very small particles, to make your battery materials that way. So it really just takes a critical rethinking of the whole supply chain and moving towards closed loop designs. So we introduced a cathode process yesterday that produces zero wastewater. The typical process, you know, just requires a ton of water and sulfuric acid. Both of those are really gnarly and bad for the environment. And now you've moved towards a closed loop system where the wastewater just is recycled throughout the process. So the opportunities very much exist. It really takes a critical look, and the battery supply chain is pretty young in the grand scheme of things. So we're just starting to see the scale, and the important thing is to act now, before the supply chain really, really grows and starts to, you know, not undo. It's definitely a net win, but we need to think carefully as we start to try to, you know, approach terawatt hours. How do we develop new closed loop processes? And how do we recycle metals to where we're not, you know, you're going to have to mine something at the end of the day, but once you get it out of the ground, it should never go back into a waste stream again. It should always go back into a battery.
Okay, that's great. And I've just directed folks in the Q&A, like if you're really interested in supply chain issues, I think that Battery Day presentation was really good, explaining how batteries are made and where the opportunities are for doing that more sustainably. So I recommend reviewing that. You know, it's a half hour, 40 minutes, and I'm sure you can find it online. And I think it answers a lot of these questions that we're getting on Tesla specifically. Where do we want to go next? I think maybe we'll go with James, if you want to talk about standalone storage versus hybrids, how does Strata see the world in terms of where there's more potential? Are you all in on hybrids, or are you doing a lot more standalone storage projects?
We do both. I think the way we look at it is that we're trying to maximize the value of each of our development assets. And so if we have storage takes up a lot more land than solar. So if we have a very large site or a large site that we're planning for solar, we will definitely be taking a look at, does it add value to put storage onto that site with the solar? And that happens with all of the projects that we're developing now. But then in addition to that, we are looking at standalone storage sites, which are completely different sites from what we do on the solar side, because they just require so much less land to get the scale that we're looking at. And so we do look at that as well. And we do have a number of standalone storage projects in development. The Ventura project I spoke about earlier is a standalone storage project. And so I don't think that we necessarily have a preference between one or the other. At a higher level, I think that there is a place for hybridization as well as for standalone storage, and as you want to be putting the storage where it is the most valuable. So depending on what problem you're trying to solve, in some cases that may be with a solar farm. If you're trying to, for example, build more solar than the local grid can take, you could put a storage system there in order to decrease the amount that's being discharged at any one time. Hybridization makes sense. If you're trying to look at like overall grid problems and trying to like offload the distribution system's peak load, then you want to have the storage very close to the consumption of the electricity. And so in a place like New York City, you're just not going to be able to put solar there. There's not enough space. So you're going to want to do standalone storage. There's a good use cases for both of them.
Great. And any other comments on that, let me know. Otherwise, I'll keep moving. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes left and still a bunch of questions to get to. How about I open it up on the policy side, just jumping around a little bit. What do you guys think could be done? What's the most impactful thing that needs to happen on the policy side to grow the stationary storage industry? I'll start with Brian.
Yeah, I can maybe give some high level things, and then maybe others can backfill with more specific policies. I guess on like the revenue value side of storage, the way I think about it, like going in order of increasing value. So one, just general renewable electricity targets, kind of indirectly benefiting storage, right? Because as we saw through one example, renewables tend to increase that power price volatility. Even better for storage, right, is if you have some kind of clean peak standard that focuses more on even like the value of energy or clean energy or when it's delivered, rather than just being pretty agnostic over time of day and just setting some gross megawatt hour target. Kind of in that similar vein, I think extremely high, like 100% clean electricity targets, just because storage seems like it's necessarily going to be part of the solution to get there. I think another important thing to highlight, like indirect but also very important, is on the cost side, right? So I think China in March just extended its EV, I can't remember if it's a tax credit or some kind of subsidy, but out to 2022. California today, I think just came out with targeting 100% fleet electrification by some date. I don't remember the exact date. I mean, but that's 11% of US vehicles. So think about the cost side, right? If you're creating a ton of additional policy demand for EVs, right, you're going to help move battery packs further down that cost curve, and that could be important for where battery storage economics end up going as well.
Great. Go ahead, David. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely doubling down on some national targets. That would be fantastic to see. The California update actually just pinged across my phone. So 0 emissions by every car sold in California starting in 2035 will have to be 0 emissions. So this is really exciting, but California is only one of 50 states. We really need some national targets to be gunning towards. But I think it's a great opportunity as well. To me, it's a real chance to bring some manufacturing capacity back into the United States. and provide a lot of important jobs for our citizens. And just to sort of tie it back to the sustainability perspective, part of why the battery supply chain has some issues with sustainability is because it's flung all over the entire world. If you start developing highly localized supply chains, that was another theme of Tesla's Battery Day yesterday, was making everything close to where you're going to consume it. A cathode processing facility right next to a lithium mine, right next to a factory. It's a closed ecosystem where you're not paying much or anything in transportation and accruing those costs. So I think getting sort of some national focuses behind that, and then also trying to create the cost incentives, I think like extending the solar tax credits to batteries could be really effective. And that would be something that we would really hope to see. And then in the longer term, I think it's a little bit tricky. It's sort of policy and business together, but trying to create what I would call a more favorable environment for battery startups. So Tesla, we've been lucky to have a lot of success, but the rest of the battery field is a lot of it looks like a graveyard right now. Just it's a really capital intensive, money intensive field to try to get started in. And we need new players. The goal is not for Tesla to become, the biggest battery manufacturer in the world. We want other people coming along with us. And so it'd be great to see some policies and some leadership geared at getting these tiny startups with great ideas to the point where they're actually putting batteries on the grid.
Great. And James, you want to weigh in on policy?
Yeah, sure. I would second David's call for a standalone storage ITC investment tax credit. That would definitely accelerate the deployment of energy storage. Beyond that, I think that the biggest regulatory changes that could be made is just to allow batteries to participate on a level playing field with other types of generation assets. That is happening, but it's still moving pretty slowly, and there are still a lot of places that or areas where batteries are not able to compete effectively. It's not always clear how to treat batteries. They sometimes are acting as a load, sometimes they're acting as a generator. So a lot of the rules in the wholesale markets and other places have to be rewritten to accommodate batteries. And until that's done, it's difficult for batteries to compete and get the revenue they need to get to be able to build and develop projects. I'd like to give one kind of local example. In New York, there's a sales tax exemption for generation as well as for transmission and distribution equipment, but not for energy storage, which sometimes is acting as generation, sometimes it's acting as T&D, but it doesn't get that exemption. That wasn't the intent when they wrote that regulation. It's just something that has to be extended because batteries are new. And I think you're seeing that process play out on a local level across the country. And as these types of regulations are changed to get batteries up to a level playing field, it'll definitely help accelerate the deployment.
Great. And we are coming up against time, so we got time for one more question for each of the panelists. If you just give me 30 seconds for the audience, if you can talk about what's the most misunderstood thing about energy storage that you come across in your day job where you have to educate folks. I'll start with David.
Yeah, I think it's not a silver bullet. We just haven't developed, same as, it wasn't ever going to be pin everything on solar or wind or hydro. We keep looking for the silver bullet. We want it. But batteries and lithium ion batteries specifically aren't going to solve all of our problems. We really need a collective mix of different storage solutions, a diversification of assets. So they are a solution, but they're not the solution.
That's great. Brian?
Yeah, I love that. I guess I'll go on a slightly different angle. One thing, I see storage pigeonholed a lot as, oh, it's kind of a clean version of replacing gas, replacing coal. But in a lot of ways, it's actually a lot more exciting, right? Gas turbines, you have to spin them up, so they're kind of slow, turning up, turning down. Batteries, infinite flexibility. So a ton of different kind of use cases for them that, in addition to just being clean, you can do a lot of other stuff with them.
Very good. And James?
Yeah, so I think As on a macro level, we can see the prices going down, we can see the values going up, and those lines crossing. So I think one of the misunderstandings that I come across is that, like, as batteries become more economically viable, that these things will just automatically kind of get deployed at scale. And in reality, every project is local. You're always going to have to do development on a project by project basis, and there's always going to be hurdles that are specific to that project, to that jurisdiction, to that energy market. And so it's important to keep getting the costs down and keep getting the supply chain more robust, and making all those things happen. But then you also have to just have just the manpower and the people in the field that are just plugging away at making these projects happen on an individual level, and actually taking advantage of all of those cost decreases and other macro level advantages that batteries have.
That's very good. Yep. These things are not just going to happen. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes here. Well, thank you, panelists, for a great session. Really appreciate it. And so Brian, James, and David, appreciate your time and your insights, and I want to say thank you to the audience as well for your attention and the good questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but I guess, Greg, that just means we need another session sometime in the next 6 months or a year. But we're going to sign off now, and thank you all for your participation. Take care.